My fishing in Tasmania hasn't all been fishing with a fly rod up in the Highlands. I came to Tasmania in the late 1970s chasing the elusive southern bluefin tuna. I'd read all the books of the early parties that came down in the 1950s and 1960s, stayed at the Louvre Hotel at Eaglehawk Neck and went out with the charter boats. And I followed them. I followed the greats like Bill Stewart and co, who'd all been down, and I'd looked up every record in the IGFA record book, and I discovered that all the big fish were taken in the first 2 weeks in May. So with Joe Wilkinson from Bicheno, we used to either arrive at Bicheno or he'd pick us up at Eaglehawk Neck, and we'd have 10 days with him the first 10 days of May. And to me, all the history of all the Australian records were in the first 10 days of May, so we charted what we thought was the cream of the season. And over the 12-year period that I fished with Joe Wilkinson, we used to travel all up and down the southern Tasmanian coast, even down to the Pedra Branca, where the game fishermen all go today. I suspect we were the first boat to go down there chasing a bluefin tuna. I remember the phallus tuna, the tuna that no one's ever caught and feed on plankton, in a school going past. We didn't catch one either, but those little phallus tuna hunt around the Pedra Branca, and one day one will see one of them go into the Australian record books with a photo. In fact, they probably have caught them now. It's just that in those days they were the impossible fish to catch. And the butterfly mackerel, what a magic little fish. We caught those occasionally, but it was the bluefin tuna that was the magic fish. And in May 1980, we were heading down out off the Lanterns there to go and fish Tasman Island, and we were just south of the Hippolyte Rock. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and every rod in the boat went off. And at that stage we'd had a few 40-pound bluefin tuna, but this was something else. Every fish that went, and sadly all the lines were crossed except my 30-pound outfit. Now we all fished 50-pound outfit for bluefin tuna because we knew they were 200-pound plus at times, and so we just fished 50-pound outfits and caught a lot of 40 and 50-pound tuna as the norm, but we were always looking for the giant. Anyway, Joe Wilkins says, "I think you've hooked a seal." And I said, "Well, Joe, it's going too fast. It's just going and going." He said, "We're nearly out of line. You'll have to turn the boat round." Anyway, we chased it. 4.5 hours later, to cut a long story short, dark has come, rain's come in, it's blowing 30 knots from the north, and I'm out in the back deck in a tractor seat, which was Joe Wilkins's game chair at the time with a gimbal in it, alone, with an occasional bloke from the cabin saying, "How are you going out there?" And Joe eventually came out and said, "Look, you've only got 15 minutes more, we're going to have to break it off. It's too late, it's after dark." And suddenly I felt the double in my hand. So I screamed out, and 10 seconds later, on the side of the boat was the biggest bluefin, bright silver even in the dark, with a torch on it. And the first gaff that went into it was just a little striped tuna gaff, and then we got a flying gaff into it, and finally we got it. That fish was 235 pound or 106 kilos today, and it's still 28 years later the world record bluefin tuna on 30 pound. I reckon in the next decade, with so many more Tasmanians fishing for bluefin, that record will get knocked off eventually. But it was a wonderful fish. It's still the best fish I've ever caught in my life, and it was a magic day. We arrived back at, we couldn't get back into Eaglehawk Neck. We went into Port Arthur. We came into Port Arthur, and I'll never forget the lights on Port Arthur. I'll never forget the Aurora Australis behind Port Arthur as the weather was clearing, and arriving and getting a truck down from Eaglehawk Neck, going up and weighing, getting the poor weighmaster of the Tuna Club of Tasmania out of bed, and weighing the fish. And finally we ended up in the Eaglehawk Neck, no, not the Eaglehawk Neck, in the Port Arthur Hotel. And the publican was just closing up. It was 11 o'clock, and I said I want to buy 2 bottles of scotch from a skipper because it was a double bottle fish. The old tradition of game fishing then was if you got a 100-pounder, you bought the skipper of the boat a bottle. And this was a 200-pound plus fish, so I wanted 2 bottles of Black Label. Well, I couldn't buy Black Label, but I got a couple of bottles of Red Label. We walked into that pub, and there were 8 in the pub. At 3 in the morning, there were 40 in the pub. As the news had got around the Tasman Peninsula, we had the biggest night that I could ever remember in my life. I couldn't even turn a reel handle the next day. I was so sore and so sick. And I think that next day we went out and caught 30 more tuna, but they were all 40-pounders. But we had the most magic time fishing with Joe Wilkinson off the south coast of Tasmania, and it was a very special part of the history for us in game fishing. And I remember those days with great fondness. Now, age 60, I think game fishing's for young blokes. I can't wind on the winder like I used to, but I still remember with great affection fishing with Joe Wilkinson from Bicheno. He was a very special, very remarkable, high character bloke to be with, and we had a lot of fun. The record that I collected in 1980 had been owned by Ian Cutler for the whole 20 years. He caught the fish in 1960 that I beat, and his fish was 176 pound, and he was such a gentleman, Ian Cutler. He was president of the Game Fishing Association of Victoria and on the executive committee of the International Game Fish Association at some point in time. And Ian sent a telegram. In those days we had telegrams, it was way before emails, sent a telegram down to me the next day saying, "Congratulations, I knew someone would catch my fish." And then he said, "I hope you have it for 20 years also." Ian died 2 years ago, and the last thing he said to me, he said, "Has that record ever been beaten?" I said, "No," and he said, "I knew it wouldn't. It was a great fish, and I'm very proud for you." And I said, "Well, Ian, my dearest wish is before I die to see somebody catch that fish that replaces my record, because that's the way records should change."